What's up, biology students? It's Mr. Holloway here with another video for you about human anatomy and physiology. And in today's video, we're going to be talking about the circulatory system, the lymphatic system, and the respiratory system. So the primary function of the circulatory system is to help us circulate blood throughout the body. And by circulating blood throughout the body, the circulatory system is able to help us deliver nutrients and oxygen to our cells. It's able to help us remove metabolic waste from our cells. It's able to help us fight infection and disease because a lot of the cells that make up our immune system are carried along with our blood by our circulatory system. It's able to help us regulate our internal temperature, and we saw an example of that in our video about the integumentary system, where we looked at the way that capillaries expand and contract or expand and recede based on changes in our external temperature. And the circulatory system also helps us to transport hormones that regulate internal processes. And we're going to learn a lot more about that in our next video about the endocrine system. Now, our heart is made up of cardiac muscle tissue. And this is the only place in the body where we find cardiac muscle tissue, is in the heart. And cardiac muscle tissue is specialized for the functions performed by the heart, namely having to contract over and over and over again every second of our lives from before the time that we're born until the moment that we die. And the main muscle layer that makes up the heart is called the myocardium. And there's a wall separating the left and right sides of the heart that's called the septum. Now, our heart has 4 chambers to it, as does the heart in all mammals. And the top 2 chambers are called atria, and we have a left atrium and a right atrium. And the atria are where our heart receives blood from the body. So blood enters the heart through either the left atrium or the right atrium. From the atria, blood is pumped into these chambers called ventricles. And the ventricles are the bottom 2 chambers of our heart. And ventricles are where blood is pumped out of our heart to the rest of the body. And then inside of our heart, we also have these structures called valves. And valves are made up of connective tissue, and they prevent blood from traveling backwards through the heart. So they keep blood traveling in the right direction as it's circulated through our heart and out to the rest of our body. If we zoom in on the heart and sort of cut it in half so that we can see the various parts inside of it, we can see here's the right atrium and right ventricle of the heart. And if you're wondering why the right atrium and ventricle are on the left side of your picture, it's because they're right in the sense that they're on the right side of your body, and we're seeing it reversed because we're seeing it from the outside. And the right side of the heart deals with oxygen-poor blood. That is, blood that doesn't have a lot of oxygen in it. So blood comes into the heart from the rest of the body through the right atrium, where it's pumped to the right ventricle, and the right ventricle then pumps that blood out of the heart to the lungs, where it can pick up oxygen. Then blood comes back from the lungs and enters the heart through the left atrium. And the left side of the heart deals with oxygen-rich blood. So it's getting blood that has a lot of oxygen in it, and it's receiving it from the lungs, and then it pumps it out to the rest of the organs of the body through the left ventricle. Here we can see that septum that separates the left and right side of the heart, as well as some of the important valves, namely the mitral valve, which separates the left atrium from the left ventricle, and the tricuspid valve, which separates the right atrium from the right ventricle. Now, in addition to our heart, our circulatory system is also made up of veins, arteries, and capillaries. Arteries are blood vessels that carry blood away from the heart, so they carry blood to the various organs of the body. Veins transport blood back to the heart from the various organs of the body. And both of these structures branch off into smaller and smaller vessels until they form these really, really small vessels called capillaries. And you'll notice that in the case of our veins and arteries, each of these structures has this middle layer of smooth muscle. But that layer is absent in the capillary. The capillaries only have 2 layers. They have that endothelium and the connective tissue that makes up the outside of that vessel. And that thinness of the capillaries makes it really easy for nutrients and oxygen and things like that to diffuse in and out of these structures. So it's through the capillaries that nutrients and oxygen are released into our cells, and it's in through the capillaries that waste products are, which are created in cells, are absorbed by our blood so they can be taken elsewhere and processed. Our circulation is made up of two circuits. We have the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. And the pulmonary circuit carries blood back and forth to the lungs. So first from the heart to the lungs, and then from the lungs back to the heart. The systemic circuit then pumps that oxygen-rich blood from the heart to all of the other organs of the body, and then back again. And that kind of can be summarized with this simpler picture that we see here, where if we follow things around a little bit, say starting with the lungs, we can see that blood flows from the lungs into the left atrium of the heart, from the left atrium to the left ventricle, from the left ventricle out to the rest of the body, from the body back to the heart through the right atrium, from the right atrium to the right ventricle, and from the right ventricle out to the lungs. So this part, going to and from the lungs, is the part of our circulation that we call pulmonary circulation. This part, where the blood goes from the heart to the body and back, excluding the lungs, is called systemic circulation. And our book depicts it this way, and our book is specifically coding it in such a way that we can see here the systemic portion of our circulation, blood going back and forth from the heart to all of the organs of the body except the lungs, are coded with white arrows. So we can see that happening here as blood travels down to the lower organs and back, and blood also travels upwards to the upper organs and back. And then we can also see that blood travels out of our heart through the pulmonary circuit to the left lung and back, and also out to the right lung and back through the pulmonary circuit of our circulation. And blood is able to transport oxygen because of a really important protein called hemoglobin. Now remember, proteins do a lot of different jobs in our body. Some of them are enzymes, some of them are antibodies that help our immune system, others of them make up cellular transport tunnels so that materials can get in and out of our cells through the cell membrane. And hemoglobin is a protein that we find in our red blood cells and that carries oxygen. Its shape is ideally suited to be able to bind with oxygen so that our red blood cells can carry oxygen out to our cells. Now our blood is actually a connective tissue, that's what we consider it to be, and it's made up of a lot of different stuff. 55% of our blood is this stuff called plasma, and plasma is about 90% water, and the other 10% of plasma is made up of nutrients, dissolved gases, hormones, salts, and things like that. The other 45% of our blood is made up of three different kinds of cells, primarily. We have red blood cells, which are often abbreviated as RBCs, and they carry oxygen because of that protein hemoglobin. And they're red because of the iron found in hemoglobin. These white blood cells, which are a lot bigger than red blood cells, and they're often abbreviated as WBCs, and white blood cells fight pathogens. They attack bacteria and parasites, and they fight infections. They basically keep our bloodstream clean of that kind of stuff. And our blood is also made up of platelets, and platelets are these cells that aid in blood clotting. And normally, our blood has a lot of these soluble proteins floating around in it. Soluble meaning that it dissolves easily in water. That makes those proteins insoluble, so they can't be dissolved in water anymore. And those insoluble protein fibers form what's called a blood clot. And that allows our platelets, along with the other cells in our blood, to repair any damage that might occur to veins and arteries and capillaries and things like that. Because as we all know, damage does occur from time to time. And when you get a cut or a scrape, those platelets start releasing this enzyme that forms a blood clot and ultimately forms a scab that eventually heals over and forms new skin. And if you're lucky, you can't even tell that you were wounded. But blood clots can also cause some problems if they form in the wrong parts of our body. If a blood clot is to get lodged in our brain, for example, that causes a stroke. And there's a couple of different kinds of strokes. There's strokes where a blood clot causes a burst and a rupture, and there's actually bleeding inside of the brain. And then there are strokes where that clot just blocks blood flow to an area of the brain, which causes that area of the brain to start to die. When blood clots form in our arteries and veins, and especially in our heart, that can cause a lot of problems as well. And a lot of these kinds of clots are formed not by platelets not doing what they're supposed to, but they're caused by a buildup of cholesterol inside of our veins, a condition known as arteriosclerosis. And as all of this cholesterol builds up inside of our blood vessels, it makes them narrower and narrower, so that eventually, if they get narrow enough, blood can't get through to the places where it needs to get through. Now, cholesterol is a major health concern, but it's not as though all cholesterol is bad. In fact, a lot of cholesterol is simply unavoidable in the food that we eat. But there are good cholesterols and bad cholesterols. And we can see in this figure that the things that we think of as being good cholesterols are these things called high-density lipoproteins. The bad cholesterols are these low-density lipoproteins. And high-density lipoproteins, or HDLs, are good because they carry away the bad cholesterol. They help break it down and carry it out so that it doesn't lead to this buildup of what we call plaque inside of our blood vessels. And remember, that buildup is called arteriosclerosis. And we can see right there an example of where this kind of thing might happen. That causes or can cause what's called a heart attack. As blood flow becomes restricted to part of the heart, that part of the heart muscle stops receiving the nutrients and the oxygen and the things like that it needs to continue doing its job. And this part of the heart that's being deprived of oxygen and nutrients is going to start to die. And that causes a very painful sensation that we associate with having a heart attack, and they can be fatal if bad enough. And so it's important in this sense to watch what you eat so that you're not eating too many of these bad cholesterols, because a buildup of those bad cholesterols in your body can lead to arteriosclerosis, the blocking of our blood vessels, which can ultimately lead to things like a heart attack. Now, the lymphatic system works very closely with the circulatory system. The lymphatic system is basically just a system of vessels punctuated with these nodes, or sort of collection areas, and it runs pretty much parallel to the circulatory system. One of the major differences between the lymphatic system and the circulatory system, though, is that whereas the circulatory system is driven by your heart, which pumps blood around your body, the lymphatic system doesn't really have a pump system. Our muscles, actually, just normal movement kind of causes those lymphatic vessels to get contracted and push this lymph around our body, but it doesn't have a pump to speak of like our circulatory system does. The lymphatic system has several important functions. A lot of fluid is actually lost from our capillaries during a normal day, and this fluid, which we call lymph, is collected by the lymphatic system. The lymphatic system then screens the lymph for pathogens and microbes, and then it returns these fluids to the circulatory system. The lymphatic system also works a little bit with our digestive system, because certain fat-soluble vitamins are absorbed by the digestive system with the help of the lymphatic system. And the spleen is sort of the major organ of the lymphatic system, other than the vessels and nodes and the lymph itself. And the spleen, which actually interacts more with the circulatory system, is responsible for storing a lot of the immune system cells that will fight disease and will be actively screening this lymph for pathogens and microbes. So the spleen plays a very important role in our immune system as well, because it's a place to hold on to some of these important immune cells. And here's a picture of a typical lymphatic node, or a lymph node. And a lymph node is basically just sort of a widening in all of these systems, and as lymph flows into a lymph node, through one of these lymph vessels, it encounters a virtual army of immune cells. All of these cells down in this region here, these densely packed B and T cells, are part of our immune system. And their job is to target and fight and attack invading organisms, pathogens like viruses and bacteria and fungus and parasites and things like that. So this fluid that gets lost from our capillaries travels through these lymphatic vessels until it reaches one of these nodes, and if there's anything in that lymph that shouldn't be there, something that might make you sick, our immune system goes to work on it and starts to break it down and hopefully kill it. Sometimes that does cause some swelling of our lymph nodes, however, and one of the things that a doctor checks when you're sick is these lymph nodes right down here in your neck. And often, if these are swollen, that's a pretty good sign that your body is fighting off some sort of an infection, because that swelling indicates that all of those immune system cells are working on something. Something was in there that shouldn't have been there, and they're trying to take care of it for us. The respiratory system has two main important functions. The respiratory system's job is 1, to take in oxygen, and 2, to excrete carbon dioxide. The respiratory system is how we exchange gases with our environment, some of which are waste products and others of which are important raw materials for really important bodily functions. And we do that gas exchange by inhaling air either through our mouth or through our nose, where it travels down into our lungs. Then we harvest some gases from that air we breathe and exchange them for other gases that we're trying to get rid of. And then when we exhale, we push that air back out of our system, once again either through our mouth or through our nose. Here in this diagram we can also see most of the important structures that make up our respiratory system, including the pharynx, which is sort of a shared space actually between the digestive system and the respiratory system, but some of these flaps in the back of our throat make sure that the right stuff goes down the right set of tubes. We also see here in this diagram the larynx. And the larynx is also what we call the voice box, and it contains these muscular fibers, and when air travels across these muscular fibers, usually when we exhale, those fibers vibrate, and that's what allows us to vocalize and make sounds with our mouth. A little further down we see the trachea, and the trachea is the cartilaginous tube, this sort of stiff tube here in the front of your throat, that ultimately leads down into your lungs. But before it gets to your lungs, the trachea branches off into two smaller tubes called bronchi. And each one of these tubes, singularly called a bronchus, then enters the lungs and branches into these even smaller branches or even smaller tubes called bronchioles. And all of those bronchioles fill up the space inside of this organ that we call the lung. Now also on this diagram we see this important structure down here at the bottom called the diaphragm. And the diaphragm is a wall of muscle that not only helps us to breathe, but it also separates our thoracic cavity, all the stuff behind our rib cage, from our abdominal cavity, or all the stuff below our rib cage. And here's how the diaphragm works. So we can see in this animation that when the diaphragm contracts and gets shorter, it actually pulls down. And by pulling down in that way, it causes our chest cavity to expand. And that expansion creates what's called negative pressure, or sort of an empty space that needs to be filled in, and that empty space gets filled in with air. And that's how we inhale. The diaphragm contracts, our chest cavity expands, and that causes air to rush out of the atmosphere and down into our lungs. Then when the diaphragm relaxes, it is allowed to push back up into the lungs, and that causes our chest cavity to contract, and that contraction forces us to exhale, or push those gases back out of our body and into the atmosphere. Now, when we inhale and we take all of this oxygen down into our lungs, one of the structures that we can't see in this figure are these tiny little structures that we'd find here down at the end of a bronchiole called alveoli. And each one of these white spheres in this diagram off to the left is called an alveolus, and each alveolus is surrounded by a network of capillaries. And remember, capillaries are very, very, very thin blood vessels, And because they're thin, it's easy for certain materials to diffuse in and out of them. And in this case, this is how oxygen diffuses out of our lungs and into our bloodstream, and how carbon dioxide then diffuses back out of our bloodstream and into our lungs so that we can exhale it. So let's take a closer look at how that works. And in this figure, we can see just one individual sac that represents all of the hundreds of alveoli we find deep in our lungs. So when we breathe in, we bring in oxygen into our alveoli, and now there's a really high concentration of oxygen inside of our alveoli. And the capillaries passing by our alveoli have a very low concentration of oxygen. In fact, the heart is pumping them to the lungs so that they can pick up oxygen. And because there's a high concentration of oxygen in the alveoli and a low concentration of oxygen in our capillaries, oxygen diffuses from our alveoli into our capillaries, where it binds with the hemoglobin carried in our red blood cells and then can be carried off to other parts of the body. Now, at the same time this is happening, our body is also getting rid of some metabolic waste, namely carbon dioxide, or CO2. And carbon dioxide, which is in our bloodstream, is in a high concentration now inside of our capillaries, and there's a pretty low concentration of carbon dioxide in our alveoli. So in this case, carbon dioxide diffuses from our capillary into our alveoli, where then it can be exhaled out back into the atmosphere again. Now, if you recall, one of the important functions of our circulatory system is to deliver oxygen to our cells and to remove metabolic waste. So here's sort of the other side of what we just saw happening in the alveoli inside of our lungs. So in this case, as a capillary is passing by a cell, in this case now the capillary has a high concentration of oxygen and our cell has a low concentration of oxygen. So this time, oxygen diffuses from our capillaries into our cells. Once again, at the same time, our cell is exchanging that for a different gas, in this case CO2. And because our cell has a high concentration of CO2 and our capillary has a low concentration of CO2, CO2 diffuses out of our cells and back into our capillaries, where there it can be taken back to the lungs, and that CO2 can be exchanged for more oxygen, and the process begins all over again. Now there's something else that's happening at this same time here, and this is actually more related to the digestive system, but as we are digesting food, we're also getting carbohydrates from our food, and we break that carbohydrate down into a monomer, a really important molecule called glucose. And just like before, since now there's a higher concentration of glucose in our capillaries than there is in our cells, this glucose diffuses into our cells, where it can provide a raw material for a very important function. Now remember that O2 that also came into our cells. This O2 and this glucose will congregate together in these organelles called mitochondria, and that mitochondria will engage in a process called cellular respiration, by which glucose, in the presence of oxygen, is converted into water and carbon dioxide, and more importantly, a whole lot of ATP, or cellular energy. So in this way, the circulatory and respiratory system are working together to support the process of cellular respiration, to support this chemical reaction that our bodies use to produce ATP, or chemical energy, because the respiratory system allows us to take in oxygen. The circulatory system then allows us to transport that oxygen to our cells, where that oxygen, along with glucose, will go through a chemical reaction that ultimately produces ATP. But it also produces CO2, and our cells need to get rid of this CO2 before it toxifies our environment. So this CO2 enters our circulatory system. Our circulatory system carries it back to our lungs, and then our lungs allow us to excrete this metabolic waste back into the atmosphere. And I guess you could say this process is also supported by the digestive system, because ultimately it's the digestive system that allows us to get glucose, or that sugar molecule that we really need in order to have this process work. Alright, now taking a look at how these three systems are all working together to maintain homeostasis inside of our body. Circulatory system. And the circulatory system helps us by delivering oxygen and nutrients to cells. And it helps us to remove metabolic waste from cells, as well as helping us to fight disease and to regulate our internal body temperature. The lymphatic system captures fluid that's lost by the circulatory system and helps return this fluid to the circulatory system so that we're not losing too much fluid and dehydrating ourselves. The lymphatic system also helps us to fight disease and infection, and it aids in the absorption of fat-soluble vitamins. And finally, the respiratory system allows us to take in oxygen and excrete carbon dioxide, some of those important materials that are consumed and produced during the process of cellular respiration. So that's it for today. Hope you learned a lot. Feel free to go back and watch this video as many times as you need to make sure that you understand the concepts. And we'll talk about some more of this stuff the next time I see you in class. Thanks for watching.